Welcome to part 11D. In 1986, Steve and John Pickford had already been game veterans in the industry, releasing conversion hits since 1984, and despite now only being 16, would start developing games full time. One of the first was a brilliant darts game called 180 for Mastertronic. The game was brilliant, perfectly mixing the British humour with compelling gameplay. But it was the following year when they released Feud, that was the original deathmatch game that really catapulted their careers. As you played Lyric the wizard who must defeat his wizard brother Leonoric before he returns a favour. The game had you collect up spells to use on your sibling and resulted in frantic gameplay. Also in 1986, two teenage brothers, Richard and David Darling, aged only 12 and 13, had already done a conversion of Master of Magic for Mastertronic, and they'd had some success with it. However, that they felt that they could cut out the publishers themselves by setting up their own company. And so, with their dad's help, they set up a new company which they called Codemasters. In 1987, Codemasters had become the darlings of the industry, having named for themselves with their simulator budget-titled games. Although not really simulation at all, they were in the main extremely fun to play and for the budget price, extremely good value. Notable games in the series was ATV Simulator, where you got to ride an all-terrain buggy across sand dunes, and BMX Simulator, a shameless clone of Super Sprint. But it was perhaps when the Darling brothers met up with another two school children who were twins and called Philip and Andrew Oliver. The Oliver twins were given by Codemasters the astronomical sum of £10,000 to write their first game for Codemasters. The game, called Super Robin Hood, was extremely polished and would do really well despite average reviews in the magazines. Interestingly, the Oliver twins would only have one computer between them at this time, taking the coding into shifts, with one sleeping while the other coded. Their second game, Ghost Hunters, was also a huge hit for the Oliver twins, which was very much geared for two players, as you could only shoot or move at the same time, and so in two-player mode it would become a game of run and cover. The game was written on the Amstrad, which the Oliver twins had bought themselves with their first paycheck, as they were sick of the Spectrum rubbery keys. In total ingenuity, they wrote a link-up program that could convert the game from Amstrad onto the Spectrum, calling the link-up Splink, which stood for Spectrum Link. The third game, Grand Prix Simulator, was basically BMX Simulator, but instead with cars, and therefore it was another Super Sprint clone. So much so that Activision, who owned the home computing license of Super Sprint, would attempt to sue. The Darling brothers, however, knew that it was little more than BMX Simulator with cars, and so released it anyway. The game was a huge success, selling 250,000 copies. Now, to put that in perspective, most number one games of the time would only sell 100,000 copies. But it would be the Oliver twins' fourth title that would hold a dear place in all our game players' hearts, and that game was called Dizzy, the ultimate cartoon adventure. The game came about when they were playing with a graphics package they had written, and was playing around with the sprite rotation function they'd entered into the graphics package. They realised that the sprite had to be quite small for it to work, and yet they still wanted the sprite to have lots of character. So they drew an oval big head and just attached little arms and legs, and then with such a big head they could draw a smiley face upon it. The character was born and become an egg, as that kind of what he looked like, and they named him Dizzy because the character would always be spinning when he jumped. The game itself had you play Dizzy as he free-ranged across the magical world to find ingredients for a potion to kill the evil wizard Zack and free the magical kingdom. The game was not a runaway success, but was a slow burner, and unlike other games that sold fast and fizzled, Dizzy just kept on selling. The game would quickly have several sequels churned out for it, each with their own charm and much bigger, more enticing world. In 1987 we had Treasure Island Dizzy, where you had to guide a shipwrecked Dizzy to escape off the desert island. Next, the Oliver twins did their first spin-off version of Dizzy with the enjoyable Pac-Man and Pac-Mania clone called Fast Food. But then they released my favourite Dizzy game, Fantasy World Dizzy, which was not only kinder to you, giving you 3 lives, but it would also introduce additional family members known as Yoke Folk. This would be the last full Dizzy game written by the Oliver twins, as they designed the game but contracted out the programming to the capable Big Red Software Limited Company, who would go on to release a string of Dizzy hits on behalf of the twins, with Magic Land Dizzy, Spellbound Dizzy, Dizzy Prince of the Yoke Folk, and Crystal Kingdom Dizzy. They would also come out with numerous spin-offs, swamping the market with Dizzy games. But back to 1987, and Archer McLean's excellent IK Plus game was released. The game took the idea of Karate Champ, but added extra players for a 3-way fight. The game was stacked full of fun and humour, and even had the infamous S&E key press that would drop the fighter's trousers. Cybernoid, a brilliant rock-hard shooter, was released this year, and had you negotiate tricky levels to take out the nasty Space Pirates Battlestar Cruiser. Back in 1986, another 2 old school friends from Chelmsford, Essex, John Hare and Chris Yates, would set up a company called Sensible Software. They would release Twister, Mother of Charlotte on the Spectrum to relative acclaim, before moving on to the Commodore 64 and producing some OK shooters, Galaxy Bird and Parallax. But in 1987 they would release 2 games that would catapult the Sensible chaps into all our gaming hearts. First was a fantastically surreal Gradius-like blaster called Whizball, which had you flying around, blasting and collecting paint. The game was great, but even better was Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit, or SUCK for short, that allowed budding kids all over the world to write their own shoot 'em up games. What was great was the ingenious menu system that let you build up a whole game and change almost any part of it without even a whiff of programming knowledge required. Zap64 would rightly vote this game the game of the decade, and you can understand why, as this really was the game that kept on giving. Other games released in 1987 was Driller, the first to use a 3D game engine called Freescape, which allowed you to build up 3D worlds. The games were amazing for the time, really feeling that you were in a virtual world as you went on exploring. They followed up the games with the Egyptian-themed Total Eclipse in 1988 and Castle Master in 1990, even releasing a 3D construction kit in 1991 for budding kids to write their own Freescape games. But back to 1987. John Rittman and Bertie Drummond, who had bought us the Batman game, would be back again with the peak of their Spectrum Games career, with the wonderful Head Over Heels. This took all they'd learned from Batman and ran with it to make an engaging world full of puzzles and Bertie's great humorous graphics. Originally they were going to call the game Foot and Mouth, but thankfully they settled instead on the name Head Over Heels. The game had you play 2 characters. There was Head, who could jump, and Heels, who was fast, and it was the purpose of the game to find each other and so combine their 2 skills and so escape. This still remains today the best Night Law variant released on the Spectrum. But over on the Commodore 64, System 3 would bring their own take of the Night Law game with the brilliant Last Ninja series. The game had you play a ninja who must puzzle solve his way through the island of Lin Fen to overthrow the evil shogun of the Ashikaga clan, who destroyed all of your fellow clan members out of jealousy. The game was a real evolution of the game style, and so would quickly have some sequels released, with Last Ninja 2 in 1988, which had you this time set in modern day New York, and finally Last Ninja 3 in 1991, that had you back in Japan again. Well, thanks for listening to Part D. Please go on to Part E, and I promise you this is the final section of this episode.